Hello and welcome to the EMJ podcast with me, your host, Dr. Jonathan Sackier. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Philip Smith, Honorary Consultant Luminal Gastroenterologist at the Royal Liverpool Hospital and Honorary Senior Clinical Lecturer at the University of Liverpool, both, of course, here in the UK. That's where I went to medical school, so I have one more reason than usual to look forward to this discussion. Philip Smith earned his medical degree from the University of Nottingham and later trained as a gastroenterologist at University College London. His current interests include inflammatory bowel disease, IBD, and intestinal failure. Dr. Smith is a national and international authority in gastroenterology. He's published over 100 peer-reviewed manuscripts in high-impact journals and has spoken and chaired meetings nationally and internationally, recently addressing audiences in Australia, the United States, Canada, Portugal, Austria, and the Middle East. As a patient with Crohn's disease himself, he's been a trustee of a number of GI charities, including Guts UK, CICRA, IBD Passport. Dr. Smith was recently the chair of elected councillors on the British Society of Gastroenterology Council and a member of their IBD committee section. He's written and contributed to national guidelines and is also editor-in-chief of Frontline Gastroenterology and digital and education editor of Gut. In his free time, and it's astonishing to think that he has any, Dr. Smith admits to being a massive Manchester United supporter. And I know that from my time in Liverpool being a Tottenham Hotspur supporter, how much grief I had to put up with. So I can only imagine how tough it is for him, especially at the moment. He's also got 3 daughters and is, as such, a taxi driver most of the time. I remember those days. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Philip Smith. Real pleasure and honor to have you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. Thank you.
You're most welcome, Phil. So first of all, tell us what initially inspired you to train in gastroenterology and specialize in luminal gastroenterology, or as we were joking before, you're a luminary gastroenterologist, and IBD in particular. Floor is yours.
That's right. Well, thank you again for inviting me. It's a pleasure to speak to you. So it's a good question to start off with because I guess for me everything's been quite new, a bit of a voyage of discovery along the way. So I'm was brought up from a non-medical background. And my parents didn't go to university even, and so being a doctor wasn't really a thing that I was expected to do really as I was growing up. But I was probably fairly bright. I was definitely enthusiastic, definitely that. Um, and grew up relatively well. But around my teenage years, as you described, I unfortunately became unwell, lost a lot of weight, bloody diarrhea, abdominal pain, and so on. And I was diagnosed ultimately with Crohn's disease. It took about 4 or 5 years back in the 1990s to get diagnosed. And that was a big moment in my life, of, as you can imagine, for a variety of different reasons, but not least me experiencing medicine, surgery, and actually it really kind of sparked my interest. I probably slightly with a kind of cocky Mancunian way. I looked at the doctors and thought, well, I could do that job. In fact, I thought I could do it better than some of them, which probably was a bit chippy of me at the time. And obviously, given Crohn's disease affects the luminal GI part of the system. I found that very interesting, and still do. But generally, as I then applied and got into medical school, progressed and qualified, went through my training, gastroenterology for me seemed a natural home. It was so diverse, so many different organs to go at. So many different pathologies from acute to chronic diseases, and so really that was it was a decision that wasn't hard to make for me. That said, I did want to become a pediatric gastroenterologist initially, and changed my mind after doing a short stint in pediatrics as a PRHO, as we used to get called, a house officer in my first year. So yeah, the only slight move I made was from pediatrics to adults, but gastroenterology was always for me.
So there was a chap I was at medical school with who had Crohn's, and he became a very prominent histopathologist. And Crohn's was, his area of study, and he was always very, very passionate about it. It actually takes me on to my next question. I believe it was in 1991, William Hurt starred in a movie called The Doctor, where he gets a taste of his own medicine. In the movie, he's not a particularly nice man. And I think they tried to position the film that he was a cardiothoracic surgeon or an ENT surgeon, I forget which, but they tried to position it, oh, here was a typical arrogant doctor getting his comeuppance. And I always thought, yeah, no, the majority of doctors I know are actually really nice people. This was just a guy who was an arrogant so and so. But you've shared your own personal experience and you've just told us a bit about it. As an IBD expert, how has this shaped your approach to the way you interact with patients?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I don't, I haven't actually, I'll admit, I haven't actually seen this movie, The Doctor. But it sounds like one that I should be
Yeah,
watching.
it's a good film. It's a good
Yeah,
film.
yeah. So people are often ask me this actually, and sometimes I stumble over what to say, because to me it's always felt quite intuitive. I just know what it feels like to be that patient in the bed, the hospital bed that is, looking up at often many people surrounding you, looking at you sometimes as though you're, maybe less of a human, but more of a something that is of intrigue. Um, and I just get that feeling, and how you feel vulnerable, how you feel acutely lonely at that moment in time, even if you've got your parents or your loved ones next to you, you know that this is going to affect me, and I need to deal with this. And so I think the only thing advantage I would say from my own personal experience is that I think I get it. I get what it's like to be at the other end of this. I understand what a kind of I guess, modern way of saying it, triggers for, getting people to speak, open up, that maybe others don't. I'm not suggesting, of course, that you have to have the disease that you're managing to be able to feel that. That lots of other people do this without the experience that I have. And to be clear, I would happily give up my Crohn's disease if I could. Within a second, that would be gone if I could. The only circumstance that I think it really helps, and really benefits is in, I've done a lot of transition work, with pediatric patients coming to adult care, um, and I think there's an acuteness of anxiety in there with the parents, as well as the individual concerned, and I think my personal insight of that really helps in that situation. I not only understand the kind of parents' perspective, the dynamic that IBD can have in the family, but also the individual, and also being a teenager with IBD is tough. At a stage in life when I wanted to be thinking about girls, and all the things that teenagers do, basically. I wasn't. I was in hospital, and I was cushing oil and big doses of steroids back in the 1990s, and my growth was delayed, puberty was delayed, all these things that you kind of would never want to even dream of talking about as a teenager. So I think that's the only circumstance, and it's actually the only environment that I've ever very occasionally opened up to a patient of mine that I have Crohn's disease, and it's usually in a situation of hopelessness where the child or the parent is feeling hopeless and lost, and like this, they're not going to have a great life, they're not going to have a future, and there's no hope. And it's in that circumstance that I hopefully bring a bit of inspiration that life goes on, things can improve, things do improve often, very often, and advances are made. And so I think an appropriate time to potentially bring that. Not always, and it's rare occasions I've done that, but on a few occasions it's been helpful, I believe.
Yeah, and thank you for that lovely insight. Of course, one of the things that has transpired during my career, certainly, is the advances in the management of things like Crohn's disease. I was talking earlier today to an oncologist, and again, the phenomenal advances in medicine that give renewed hope to people who are dealing with this. And I once I went to I was living in the United States, to a dinner, the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation dinner, and I sat next to, boy, I met some incredible people. Mandy Patinkin, the actor and singer whose sister had Crohn's disease. The drummer from, I think it was Pearl Jam, who was there. There was a chap I'm a pilot by avocation. There was a guy from the American Air Force who had been an F-16 pilot, and it was fascinating to hear everyone's stories and to hear about mental fortitude. I guess that takes me on to my next question, which is, as you've gone through your career, we all have high and low points. And, given that you've also had to deal with a gastrointestinal disorder, inflammatory bowel disease, tell us some of your career high and low points from whichever perspective you care to.
Yeah, this is obviously a tough question to answer in some respects. Maybe I'll start with the good moments. So, I mean, I think there's been some massive highs along the way. I've won plenty of prizes, which I'm obviously very proud of. I remember winning the British Society of Gastroenterology's President's Medal. Um, Obviously, it's always very nice, as I've been fortunate enough to be invited to speak to big national and international conferences around the globe. I think that's always a high point, and it's nice. I think a big thing for me has been I have done a lot of work in publishing, and I think I started off as the trainee editor of Frontline Gastroenterology over a decade ago. Um, and I think I did a fairly decent job, and then progressed up to an associate editor, then a deputy editor, and now the editor in chief. I think that's been a positive, had a positive impact. Working with obviously Guts, who's a massive international journal, and Professor El Omar, the editor in chief of that journal, so fantastic inspiration to me personally. Um, Slightly different things. I set up a course in the UK called the BSG Taster Course in Gastroenterology. Basically, the premise behind it is to get the kind of newer generation of medical students and junior doctors, or resident doctors as they're now called, to consider gastroenterology as a career. And that started about 13, 14 years ago, and it's been hugely successful. There's been hundreds of, in fact, it would be thousands of people attended that. And the feedback's always brilliant from that. Many of the people that I now see as peers and colleagues actually attended that, and they say, "Oh, I remember Phil, you setting up this course, and it's still running." And I still get invited back to give the talk. So those are kind of high points, because you realise that there can be a real lasting impact. Low points are hard to speak about with anybody, and I promise I won't get too emotive. But clearly, I've had Crohn's disease for nearly 30 years now, and there's been many low points that have impacted on career. I've had to take some time out occasionally if I've needed surgeries or been really unwell, been in hospital in bowel obstruction. I've been in intensive care several times, unfortunately, but thankfully come out as of the other side. And again, that's had an impact. And every time that happens, you feel like you have to brush yourself down, kind of pick yourself up and motivate yourself to keep on moving forward, without sounding too like Rocky Balboa, saying that. You do try and just keep that positive momentum going. Really tough times, I would say, actually was again related to training. training's hard in the UK. It's long. I did a period of time doing PhD research. Got a grant from the Medical Research Council. It all sounds amazing so far, doesn't it? But actually, it was a really toxic and difficult environment I was in. The the attitude was, how do you not know how to do this scientific method already of PCR? How do you not know how to analyze, 49,000 genes transcriptomically? Why are you not a biased statistician already? Kind of attitude. And it's such a weird environment to be in that, because I'm sure that's not kind of how most people experience research. I know research is difficult, but it was just a very toxic, very difficult environment to work in, and nothing was ever good enough. And actually, it was in IBD. It was in IBD that the research occurred, and that made it more difficult because you were with some great minds in scientifically in IBD, but when I was unwell, even they had no clue about what it actually meant, and how it impacted on an individual. It just wasn't a good environment. And I think as much of that was kind of my naivety, and I probably should have chosen much better people to work with. Um,
Yeah.
but you live and learn,
Yeah.
and I learned the hard way in that circle.
Well, I have five operating principles for my life, and one of them is taken from a book by Robert Sutton, who's a sort of a business guru in the States. And I think he now lectures at Stanford or Berkeley, one of those places. His book is called The No Asshole Rule. Here it would be the no arsehole rule. And his basic premise is, you know, the way that people behave and treat one another is the most important. And I quote this often. Sir William Osler, uh, first professor of medicine at Johns Hopkins, said that a good physician should be able, well, that's obvious, available, that's really nice, sadly not true nowadays, but the most important is affable. Just be nice. It really doesn't cost any more. And my dad had a great expression. He said, the biggest compliment you can ever pay someone is to ask for their help. So I'm sorry that you had such a crappy experience with people who should have been saying, you don't know how to do this. It's my pleasure to show you. So, but I'm sure you treat everyone much nicer. Let's go into some of the research that you've done. I said that you've published extensively, and you've referenced it as well. Can you share some of the most impactful findings from your work in IBD treatments, particularly with monoclonals like infliximab?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll come on to that, because I think that probably is my most impactful work in relation to that. But I think probably the publication I'm most proud of was that we wrote the first ever transition guideline ever in the UK, and I was first author on that. It was published in Gut a few years ago. I think I think that felt like an end of a long journey, a personal journey. That is, I know everybody's on a journey of sorts nowadays, but that 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 probably is something that I felt proud of, and I still feel proud of, because that's there on the record. I did that with colleagues, and I enjoyed doing it. Probably my most impactful work, though, is probably in the last few years, when I've actually not been particularly well during that period of time, was related to my work on subcut infliximab, particularly. Um, During the pandemic in Liverpool, we were really struggling in a big way managing our IBD patients. We have a quite a deprived region, a population that often turns up at hospital as their first port of call, as opposed to general practitioners, although they're under the cosh as well, of course. And so we were we were very much in trouble with COVID very early on in the pandemic, and lost our IV infusion capacity for infliximab, which for any team in the IBD world is a disaster, basically, because it's one of our, if not our most commonly prescribed biologic. And so we needed a solution quickly. There was no solution licensed in the UK for IBD, but there was a subcut infliximab which was brand new for rheumatoid arthritis at the time. And basically, myself, another colleague, and the wider team at the Royal Liverpool managed to negotiate that we could use this off license, and we treated nearly 200 people with this brand new biologic. And as it turned out, it was a first real world experience anywhere in the globe, anywhere in the globe. And we were doing it in Liverpool. And that paper that we wrote as a result of our experience has been highly cited. It's been something that I've been asked to speak about many times in many different countries. And so it really has made a lasting impact, because clearly our experience then provided motivation for other hospitals, other units, and gave them confidence to unit, and real world studies, etc., really do provide that. And so, yeah, I think that probably is my most impactful work.
Yeah, wonderful. So, I mentioned in my introduction you've spoken at conferences around the world. What differences do you notice in how IBD and gastroenterology are approached internationally compared to the UK? I'm going to come on to colonoscopy in a minute, so
Yeah.
leave that one aside.
Okay. Well, so this question's again a challenging question, because in the UK we have a training system where we do something called, we dual accredit in gastroenterology and general internal medicine alongside each other, and about 90 to 95% of all gastroenterologists do this. So um, some gastroenterologists, when they become consultants, eventually will be doing, alongside their gastroenterology work, they'll be doing some general internal medicine work as well. Not everybody, but there's a significant number of that. And so the focus, even for highly trained individuals in GI, is not always completely on gastroenterology. So that's one thing that I think does separate us from most other places, or certainly a significant number of other places in the world, is that you have to be broader, and your knowledge has to be broader in lots of different areas. The training is long and hard, and actually, I know I'm not going to touch on endoscopy for long, but you can struggle even to get endoscopy skills and training because of that broadness and because of those other demands in your time. The UK is also an unusual place. We've got a National Health Service, which is almost like a religion in the UK, and for I think for many good reasons that's the case. But a downside to that is that a lot of care has now been centralized, so that it's sometimes available in some areas, but it's not always available to everybody as easily. And for example, intestinal failure is in that situation now. If you need surgery for intestinal failure, you can't always easily get it where you live. You may have to travel several hundred miles, or at least over 100 miles to get that. So I think that's a challenge, and is something that we're not as good at. I think pay in the UK is clearly behind where it is. I know we shouldn't always. It's very British not to talk about pay ever, but I think that is a factor that people are realizing more and more in the UK, especially as there is a huge demand of time and pressure on clinicians in the UK. Some people do private work alongside their NHS work, but many don't. In IBD, we're quite lucky. There are many experts in IBD in regions, but there's probably some inequalities there still as well. Is that there's some regions and some areas that get more access to things more easily than others, so it's not always a level playing field. Um, Also, we like to cut the cloth as fine as we could get it, as tight as we could get it, and funding is an issue in the National Health Service. We don't always get the funding we need for IBD care. Um, but I think there's lots of great things in the UK, in terms of which defines us differently from elsewhere. I think the things like the NIHR and the funding that came through for research for that, um, the IBD community generally and the gastroenterology community, I think, works relatively well together. There's good examples of that. There's been a profile study published in the Lancet Gastro HEP journal recently. The IBD Bio Research is a good example of that. I think there's still areas of improvement with inclusivity with that, but I think the UK does very well in those areas. Certainly when everybody's pulling together and working in the same direction.
Hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, I worked half my life in the United States and certainly saw some differences, and I'll come back to that. But there's something actually, no, I'm going to ask you now. Like I say, I practice surgery over there. Screening colonoscopy is much more widely used than here. In fact, I lived in America for half my life. And when I returned to Britain a few years ago and asked my doctor about getting one, I was literally laughed out the practice. And I did a lot of colorectal surgery work. And I lost one of my dear friends who was a surgical oncologist and stupidly never had a screening colonoscopy. And he died from colon cancer. Why do we not use it here more widely?
Yeah, it's a very topical area. There's I mean, I'm obviously into gastroenterology, but that's having the same sort of discussion with conditions like prostate cancer, for example, in early detection of that in the UK. Ultimately, to be balanced in responding to this, there are in our health service limited resources. We have to accept that, and I think there is a big drive at the moment to utilize endoscopies, particularly in an evidence based way, by trying to identify who needs to be scoped the most and then target that as closely and as best as we can so that you're ideally um, targeting those at the highest risk of developing cancers or other types of pathology, and therefore reducing unnecessary scopes on on patients that don't need it. For example, with symptoms consistent with irritable bowel syndrome, for instance. There are a variety of different ways that this is done. Obviously, simple history taking and risk factors in terms of family histories, genetics, etc. But also biomarkers, the likes of the FIT test, for screening. It used to be fecal occult blood testing, of course, is available in the UK. But FIT testing is being used for IBD, fecal calprotecting screening, although that, fecal calprotectin that's positive isn't always IBD because there are other things that driving it up. But it's balancing all of these things, and this is difficult. And so, whilst I know in the States, because I've got a family member that lives out there as well, you can if you've got the money, certainly, and your insurance cover, get a scope. If you're worried or concerned, fairly promptly. I'm not saying necessarily via an insurance company because I know there's difficulties with that in the States. But the UK does work and still works, and I imagine will continue to work differently. It's done based upon need rather than concern, and people are risk stratified as much as any available system, be that history taking, biomarkers, etc. can. It's not perfect though. And there'll always be people that should have been scoped, should have been screened, and weren't.
Yeah. I always struggle with, while I understand the benefit and the evidence base for guidelines, the clue is in the word guidelines. And as doctors, our obligation is to the patient sitting in front of us, not the totality of the population. So I think you and I could have a broader discussion about that. I mean, the data that the American Society of Colon and Rectal Surgery and the gastroenterologists over there, I mean, they screen up, your insurance company will cover it at 50 and above. And I think there's pretty good evidence. But anyway, we could have a broader discussion. So I've got a three-parter for you. You're a leader in the British Society of Gastroenterology, including your role in creating guidelines. What do you see as the biggest advancements and future priorities for GI in the United Kingdom? Can you tell us about the 2024 iteration of the BSG IBD guidelines? And as another government comes in yet again to move things around in healthcare, they'll doubtless come up with some more alphabet soup, and they'll rearrange the deck chairs. What do you hope for your specialty? So that's your three-parter for you.
Yeah, so great questions. So without getting too political, because I know there's a lot of politics around at the moment. And I'm bearing in mind that I am somebody that really does put his head above the parapet, and speak out for UK gastroenterology, and the needs of training, etc., and future trainees, etc. Is that I think I'll being honest, I am slightly worried about the future of gastroenterology in the UK. Probably not just gastroenterology, but other specialty areas as well, because there is a tremendous amount of pressure on training, where the government, previously, that was in power for 14 years, and now the current government, the penny doesn't seem to have dropped yet, that they're not training enough. There's not enough training numbers to accommodate future workforce force needs, and therefore there's gaps all over the place in terms of workforce requirements, endoscopies needing. Um, there's not enough focus given to procedural specialties and allowing them to practice their craft, such as endoscopy. So I know the resident doctors that are coming through are struggling getting their numbers, and there's lots of evidence base out there that's been published on this, about people not getting competent enough even by the time that they're due to be finishing their training. There's also a push, it seems, clearly from the powers above to replace doctors with other allied healthcare practitioners of some sort. There's a big push on something called the physicians associates in the UK, which is a hugely topical and up for debate area, because they are filling gaps in doctors on calls despite much lesser training. And so the reason that I think that I feel concerned is that unless things change, we're heading to a cliff edge where, the future workforce is going to be so under pressure and so under demand that I suspect it's just going to drive people away to the likes of the States and to Canada and to Australia and to Europe and other parts of the world where training and working as a doctor is seen to be more work life balance, acceptable, prioritized. So that is a big area. In terms of advancements in the future, I mean, there's to be positive. There's some amazing advancements, and the things that I'm excited about. I think the advancements in the microbiome and its understanding is really gaining pace. I think that's really exciting. I think we are, as the editor in chief of Gut says, we are the owners of the microbiome in the gut, and so I think that's a really exciting area. We don't fully understand it yet, but I think there could be really important advances in therapeutics that come as a result of that. I think IBD therapeutics, there's been a massive explosion in those in the last few years, and that's exciting. Personally, I'm excited, of course, about the continuing advancement of hepatitis C care. It's not my area, but I remember qualifying from medical school, and I'm sure you do, where that was a life sentence. Hepatitis C, but now there's a cure for it. Artificial intelligence also really exciting area. I'm wondering what direction will come next. It's been focused mainly on endoscopy, but big data sets, um, clearly that's going to have a impact in the future, but I'm not sure exactly how. in terms of you mentioned about the BSG IBD guidelines, they're a massive deal. Those guidelines they take often several years, as it has done, to make this iteration to put together. It's over 200 pages long, so it's going to have its own special issue of gut. I suspect as a result of that. This guideline is very, very different now, and I don't think I'm breaking any embargoes saying this. It's based around a network meta analysis approach to the different therapeutics in IBD, so that it's no longer as quite as subjective in terms of its recommendations. It's based upon data that's come out of this network meta analysis, and there's going to be, I'm sure, lots of discussion about the pros and cons of network meta-analysis and what that actually means. I think it's going to be exciting. I think there are a few things that people are going to be surprised by. I can't say too much yet because it's under review at the moment. Um, I think my gut instinct is that people are going to take a while to find it potentially hard to understand exactly what the guidelines are saying or not saying. I think people may interpret the guidelines as a way of ranking therapeutics, whereas actually that isn't the motivation or the intention. But so I think messaging around that's going to be important. Um, in terms of the hope uh, for this current government, the Labour government, left wing government, or centre left government, I should probably describe them. I think the biggest thing in the UK, at least, would be that they could do is help the workforce and the specialty reclaim its training again. I think that's been lost. I think there's too many other demands from other areas, particularly general internal medicine, which I'm not dismissing as unimportant at all. Quite the opposite. It's very important. But if you want high quality gastroenterologists, you're going to have to let them train as much as they can in gastroenterology rather than pulling them in a multitude of directions and failing at everything. So that would be my biggest hope, is that the government can facilitate that change where training opportunities in GI are optimized.
Right, right. Well, it needs people like you to put your head above the parapet and make sure that the people making these decisions for our future are actually listening to the people who know a little bit about it. Heaven forbid. So, Phil, you've leveraged social media to engage with the GI community. You do podcasts. We'll put some links in the show notes so people can find your podcasts. How do you see digital platforms transforming medical education and patient outreach in the coming years? Especially, we've got responsibilities on social media. We can't ignore it because there's so much garbage out there, pseudoscience. I do another podcast for the lay public, and I love tilting at these particular windmills because they're dangerous, frankly.
Yeah, gosh, this is a big area to discuss. We could talk, I'm sure, for hours just on this.
Hmm.
The reality of the world that we live in, and my kids live in now, I've got fairly young children, is that everything is accessible within a click of your fingers, and it's easy, it's rapid access. You don't even need to open a laptop anymore. You can just whip out a mobile phone, cell phone, whatever you describe it as, and it's there, and you get the answer. The problem is that, as you've very aptly said, is that there's a lot of dross out there. There's a lot of disinformation on there, and let's face it, there's a lot, and I think it's grown exponentially since COVID. There's a lot of anti-vaccination information, which is for just as an example out there, and I do personally think that what I signed up to as a doctor is to speak the truth, is to be honest, and present facts. Forget feelings. Facts matter. Facts matter. And so but it's a tsunami of mistruths out there, and deconstructing that isn't possible as a single individual. and it's not possible even on a single platform. It needs to be a collective pushback. And of course, podcasting is one way of doing it. People hear us talk and speak in conversation in the way that we are doing at the moment. There's other platforms. I think Twitter, now X, has undergone some changes with its fairly new ownership, which I don't think has necessarily been a positive change in many respects, but other people may have differing opinions on that. Facebook and Instagram, similar sorts of issues, I guess, and TikTok, YouTube. The truth is that we're all fighting against algorithms now. I mean, I talked about AI. I mean, that's what we're up against. We all can, with opinions and even with facts, get cocooned in these bubbles, or echo chambers as they're now called. So it's difficult, but I think being positive about it, getting the correct information out there, such as we try to in frontline gastroenterology, gut, and the other BMJ journals that I work with, is important. There are things that go down really well. So pictures or figures from papers give clear explanations. I think that helps people understand various facts and science. I think some things are harder to articulate than others. So basic science, as I have to do podcasts with lots of basic scientists, can be difficult because people get confused and kind of bemused by all the scientific terminology, and so trying to demystify that is difficult. And so I tend to, with my approach to the podcast that I do, to use open questions. I try and stick to a format which allows authors the confidence to explain their work as clearly as possible. I think clinical podcasts, for instance, are much easier to understand and often um, easier for people to engage and converse with. Um, but sometimes they can be seen as more opinion based as opposed to factual. It depends on obviously the topic and the papers and the research involved. But I do. I'll be honest. My favorite platform is the podcasting because you actually hear from the real person. You actually hear directly from them. There's no way that they're their own words. There's no way that it can be twisted or converted. You're hearing directly, and I think that's really interesting and important as well.
Yeah, very much so. I've actually seen recently someone shared with me a podcast and asked me what I thought about it. And I said, oh, I think it was pretty good. And they said, guess what? I said, what do you mean, guess what? They said, whole thing was generated by AI.
Oh wow!
And the questions, the answers, the discussion, and my goodness, whilst AI cannot do humor, believe me, I've tried. I was just using it just before we started chatting to sort out some statistics for a paper I'm writing. And my God, it was fast. And I double checked it. You know, it took me about an hour and a half to double check everything, but boom, there it was. Anyway, so I've got another three-parter for you, Phil. As
Yes.
editor-in-chief of Frontline Gastroenterology and your work with gut, what excites you about being involved in publishing? What trends in gastroenterology research get your juices going? And what do you look for in high-impact studies?
Oh, great question. So, I mean, I do love the kind of publishing pathway for all of its flaws, and we won't get into the issues with peer review and so on and so forth, and the debates about open access, etc., or not open access. What I like about it is that you're literally seeing something brand new. You're often the first person to see it when it comes into the journal. You're the person that's often the first outside of the team that's produced the work. Often you're the first to see it, and you get to hopefully when it's well put together, get to see what impact it could have, how it could change things in the future. Um, It's also nice that when sometimes during the peer review process, it's meant to be constructive as opposed to adversarial. Um, it's nice to see that potentially a paper that might appear quite dry, not as interesting, after undergoing the peer review, can be brought to life suddenly, and then really, become a really important, useful tool, often sometimes with just fairly simple things, the addition of a figure or a table, or some caveats in it, or whatever the peer review really brings up, to be honest. But I mean, that's what I love about it, particularly in relation to frontline gastroenterology. I particularly like seeing a very clinical topic, which I know from personal experience is poorly done, such as some of the neurogastro kind of specialty areas, for example. And if you produce a good paper in that area, people love it because they often are insecure about, how do I manage that situation? What's the evidence base? And they use it and read it. And that's why we get great feedback in FG in relation to those sorts of areas. In terms of excitement and in terms of trends in gastroenterology research, well, I'm obviously going to say I'm excited about IBD care in the future. I've mentioned already about there's been an explosion in different therapeutics in the armamentarium that we now have, which is so different from 20 years ago, which is exciting. I think what would be even more exciting is if we could personalize care even more. And, we know that Crohn's and UC, for instance, are kind of almost umbrella terms for very complex disorders, and that what we see in the bowel is kind of the final common pathway of inflammation, which looks like Crohn's or looks like UC, but that might be caused by a collection of genetic or environmental or microbial changes in one person, which slightly differs in another person, but leads to the same sort of phenotypic demonstration in the bowel. And it'd be good to be able to work out who is who eventually, and therefore target treatment according to what works. A bit like in breast cancer, where you can target based upon hormone levels and hormone responsiveness to treatment. It would be good if we could do that. I'm obviously, as I mentioned, excited about the microbiome. I think it's a massive area with massive potential in the future. Very hopeful about MASLT, as it's now referred to, and kind of the idea of antifibrotic treatments. But in relation to that, I think some of the GPL-1 drugs that are available and the weight loss treatments is interesting and exciting, and could have a major impact potentially if used appropriately, and certainly in Western cultures, the UK, the United States, and so on and so forth. And obviously, I've touched on it already. AI, as you've described, is going to change a lot of things. So they're kind of the kind of areas that I think are most exciting. What do I look for in high impact studies? I think was the final part of your question. I look for things that are going to change practice, that are going to change the way that we think and approach things, that are going to have real lasting effects on patients, and that doesn't necessarily need to be the latest drug or treatment. That can be the way that we manage patients or monitor patients or whatever. Um, that's what excites me. Things that are going to progressively improve things for patients.
Well, we've certainly seen during your career, during my career, science is increasing, and the rate at which scientific knowledge is increasing. And I think the impacts of AI interpreting big data is where I get really turned on by it. Final question. You come across a magical genie. Let's say you go for a walk on Southport Sands, you kick a bottle, you pick it up, you give it a rub, out pops a genie. Dr. Philip Smith, you have 3 wishes for gastroenterology. What are your 3 wishes?
So you've already taken one of my wishes earlier on by saying that decision makers actually listening to people that know what they're talking about, and often.
I said you could have wishes. I didn't say you could have actual fantasy. I mean, that really is fantasy.
Okay,
Heaven.
okay.
Yeah. But
Well,
yeah,
maybe I've
no, we'll give you that one. We'll
okay,
give you that one.
okay. So I mean, I think that would make a huge difference, to because sometimes the people that are at the higher end of the decision makers at the top of the tree, to use the kind of metaphor, are disconnected, and that disconnect leads to wrong decisions, inadequate decisions, which I don't think ultimately help anybody. Um, what I would like to see in IBD care is investment in cures, or prevention, as opposed to not just the treatments. Obviously, the pharma industry is very much focused on treating the inflammation. I'd like to see as much investment as possible in actually finding out what causes the likes of Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, so that we can nip it in the bud earlier on, and prevent people getting those horrible diseases. Same with other conditions, clearly, as well. Very finally, and this is such an obvious thing for me, or it feels like it is, at least to me, is that we need to realize in healthcare that we don't have healthcare for our patients unless we look after and really invest in the workforce that look after patients. We talk about in the UK about the National Health Service. Well, the National Health Service is the workforce. It is the people that work in it. It's not the buildings or the machines. It's the people that um, work with those in those buildings and work with those machines to make the patients better. Because you can have all the machines in the world and you can have all the fancy buildings in the world, but if you've not got the staff and you've not invested in the staff to do it, they're just empty buildings and they're just machines that won't work. So that for me is ultimately what is crucial to really, really help patients, which is what it's all about.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for that. It's been a real pleasure chatting to you, Dr. Philip Smith, even if you are a Man United supporter. Um,
We all have our vices.
yeah, well, I don't know about vices. It's like a cross to bear. It really is.
Yes, okay.
Watching a football team really, really does that. But I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. So thanks for spending time with us. Thanks for everything you have done and are doing for patients living with gastroenterologic disease. Real pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you again. Thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome. So, folks, to those of you listening, thanks for listening. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please make sure you subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. Like us, leave a review, tell your friends, tell your colleagues, and check out the archives. Lots of great stuff in there. Several hundred episodes now. And please join us next week for another fascinating episode. Until then, I'm your host, Dr. Jonathan Sackier. Thanks so much for listening to the EMJ podcast. Please, everyone, stay safe, stay well, and stay curious. Bye for now.